My own daughter and her husband isolated me in my own home, pretending to care for me while they waited for me to die. They were so ungrateful, treating me like an inconvenience as they tricked me into signing over my entire multi-million-dollar estate. They thought they had gotten away with it, but they didn't know I had one final surprise planned for them after my funeral. It was so satisfying to watch their jaws drop when they realized they weren't getting a single penny. At my 82nd birthday lunch, the late afternoon sun streamed through the dining room windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It was just the three of us in my big, quiet house in Westchester. My daughter Susan and her husband Mark had brought a cake and a bouquet of lilies that were so fragrant they were almost suffocating. They sang Happy Birthday, their voices a little too loud, a little too bright. Susan's smile was a masterpiece of effort, a carefully painted expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She kept complimenting the house, the one I'd shared with her father for nearly 50 years. She'd run a hand over the mahogany sideboard and remark on how much work it must be to maintain such a large place, her words a delicate probe disguised as a compliment. Mark, on the other hand, was a coiled spring of anxiety. He spent most of the lunch with his phone buzzing in his lap, stealing glances at the screen under the table. Each time it vibrated, his jaw tightened. They thought I didn't notice these things, that age had softened the edges of my perception, but I saw everything. I saw the strain behind their doting facade, the faint, sour scent of desperation clinging to them like cheap cologne. In the weeks that followed, their care intensified. It began subtly. They started screening my calls with Susan, explaining that there were so many sophisticated scammers targeting seniors these days. It was for my own protection, she'd say, patting my hand. Then they began collecting my mail from the box at the end of the long driveway. It was all just junk and bills anyway, Mark insisted, and he'd be happy to sort through it for me to save me the trouble. My world began to shrink, its borders defined by their loving concern. One afternoon, my neighbor Eleanor Gable dropped by with a tin of her famous lemon bars. We'd been friends for 30 years. Mark met her at the door and politely told her I was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. Later, when I asked about it, Susan explained that Eleanor was sweet, but a notorious gossip, and they didn't want her tiring me out with her endless chatter. The isolation was gentle, almost imperceptible, but it was absolute. I was living in a gilded cage, its bars forged from their supposed affection. Then came the day of the real betrayal. It wasn't dramatic, not a scene from a movie. It was quiet and mundane, which made it all the more chilling. Mark arrived one morning with a handsome leather portfolio under his arm. He spread a stack of papers on the dining room table, explaining that their accountant recommended updating my portfolio for tax purposes. He used a lot of financial jargon, his voice smooth and reassuring. Susan sat beside me, nodding along. "It's just routine, Mom," she said. "A few signatures to simplify things for us down the line." She pointed to the signature lines, her manicured finger tracing the empty space. Buried deep within the stack, disguised by clauses and legalese, was a new will. I knew it the moment I saw the heading, though they'd tried to make it look like just another page in a long document. I let my hand tremble a little as I picked up the pen. I looked at my daughter, at her encouraging smile, and I felt a profound and bottomless sorrow. Then, feigning the frailty they so desperately wanted to see, I signed my name where she pointed. That evening, a profound quiet settled over the house. Susan and Mark had gone back to their home in Connecticut, leaving me in the silence they had so carefully constructed. I was walking in my soft slippers, making no sound on the old Oriental runners in the hall, when I heard Mark's voice from the study. He must have forgotten his briefcase and returned for it, thinking I was already in bed. The door was slightly ajar, and his voice was a low, frantic whisper, a sound stripped of all its earlier smoothness. I stopped hidden in the shadows of the hallway and listened. The fragments of his conversation were like shards of glass. He said, "The extension is denied," his voice cracking on the last word. Then a moment later, "They'll file the foreclosure notice on the 1st." There was a long pause, and then the words that confirmed everything, the words that turned my sorrow into a cold, hard resolve. "No, she has no idea. If this doesn't work, we lose everything." The raw, undiluted desperation in his voice was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just greed that was driving them, it was terror. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I let a few days pass after overhearing Mark's phone call. I needed them to settle back into their false sense of security to believe their secret was safe. I chose a Tuesday morning during one of their tense, quiet breakfasts to make my first move. The air was thick with unspoken things. I slowly stirred my tea, letting the silence stretch until it was taut. Then I looked up at Susan, my expression one of mild grandmotherly confusion. I told her that her friend Barbara had called the day before. It was a complete lie, of course. I went on to say that Barbara had mentioned they were selling their lovely summer cottage, and I mused aloud that I hadn't even known they were thinking of it. The effect was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Susan froze mid-bite her fork, clattering onto her porcelain plate with a sharp crack that shattered the morning quiet. Across the table, Mark's head snapped up and he shot his wife a look of pure, unadulterated panic. The mask of doting concern dissolved, revealing the terrified faces beneath. Susan stammered that I must be mistaken that Barbara hadn't called. At the exact same moment, Mark blurted out that they were just considering their options, a desperate attempt to create a plausible story. Their conflicting denials, their shared look of terror, it was all the proof I needed. They were not master criminals, just two panicked amateurs caught in a web of their own making. Their guilt was as clear as the morning light streaming through the windows. I used their flustered chaos as my cover. Feigning a sudden weariness, I told them I felt a bit tired and was going to go lie down for a nap. They were so busy trying to get their story straight in frantic whispers that they barely noticed me leave. In my room, I didn't go to the bed. I went to the deep walk-in closet to a dusty hat box on the top shelf that hadn't been touched in years. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a prepaid burner phone I'd bought for cash 2 months ago. I dialed a single number. The voice on the other end was young but steady. It was David Chen, the man who had taken over the firm of my late husband's trusted lawyer. I spoke quickly, my voice low but clear. I told him it was Margaret O'Brien. I said we needed to activate the charitable bequest contingency. They had made their move, sensing they had been exposed on some level, even if they didn't know how Susan and Mark's control became suffocating. The passive aggression of the previous weeks morphed into active oppression. They insisted on being present for everything, even a simple checkup with my doctor hovering over me and answering his questions for me. They began to openly discuss the value of my belongings right in front of me, pointing out antiques they deemed unnecessary, and talking about how selling them would help reduce clutter and simplify my life. The gilded cage was shrinking, its bars growing colder and harder. I looked at their anxious faces, the greed warring with their fear, and I understood something new. They were not just selfish. They were desperate, and I knew that desperate people were the most dangerous kind of all. When you know your opponent is dangerous, the last thing you do is stand your ground. You execute a strategic retreat. In the days following my little breakfast probe, I became the woman they wanted me to be. I grew more forgetful, sometimes asking Susan the same question twice in an hour. I became more frail, leaning heavily on Mark's arm whenever we walked to the car. I thanked them constantly, my voice quavering with manufactured gratitude, telling them over and over that I didn't know what I would do without them. And they, in their arrogance, soaked it all in. They were completely convinced that my sharp question about the cottage had been a simple, fleeting moment of confused memory. Their paranoia vanished, replaced by a smug certainty. They saw me as a problem that was now fully and finally managed. On the days they drove back to Connecticut to maintain the facade of their own lives, I could practically hear the conversations they must have had in the car. I could picture it perfectly. The tension in that confined space, the carefully constructed masks finally slipping. I imagined Susan's voice sharp with blame, reminding Mark that this was all his fault. His failed technology business, his ego. I could hear his desperate justifications, his voice cracking as he talked about the massive seven-figure loan he'd taken out against their home, a last-ditch effort to save his company that had only dragged them deeper into the abyss. I could feel their shared terror as they discussed the threatening letters from creditors, the whispers they imagined were circulating in their exclusive social circle. In those imagined car rides, their desperation was a living thing, a third passenger on the seat between them. My house, my legacy wasn't just a windfall to them. It was their only lifeline to avoid complete and utter public ruin. The moment their car was out of my long driveway, I would go to work. While my captors were away, their prisoner was anything but idle. I'd go to my late husband's study and retrieve an old laptop from a hidden compartment behind a row of encyclopedias. It was offline, secure, used only for one purpose, corresponding with David Chen. Following his encrypted instructions, I moved through my own house like a spy. I located my original valid will hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of War and Peace. I found the key to a secret safe deposit box taped to the back of a framed photograph of my parents, and I sat at my desk and wrote a long letter in my clearest handwriting, detailing every instance of their emotional abuse, their isolation tactics, and the final deception of the fraudulent will. I packaged it all, the will, the key, the letter, in a discreet manila envelope, just as David had instructed, ready for the courier he had arranged. Convinced they had won, convinced I was a doddering old woman who had been successfully managed. Mark and Susan made their first critical error. Their relief and arrogance made them sloppy. They began to spend money they didn't have, celebrating a victory they hadn't yet achieved. I found out from a glossy brochure for a new Mercedes that was accidentally left on the kitchen counter. Later, a misdirected email intended for their financial planner confirmed it. They had put a non-refundable down payment on the top-of-the-line model. They were building a narrative of success, telling friends at their country club that they were expecting a significant windfall from a shrewd family investment. They were creating a public record of their expectations, laying the foundation for their own spectacular downfall. And I, in the quiet of my gilded cage, was simply letting them. The plan I had set in motion did not require my physical presence to see it through. A few months after the courier made his discreet pickup, I passed away peacefully in my sleep on a Tuesday in early spring. The funeral was a tasteful affair, exactly as I had stipulated. Susan and Mark played the part of grieving children perfectly. A week later, I watched as they moved through my house, their grief having miraculously evaporated. They weren't mourning. They were taking inventory, their voices filled with a smug sense of ownership as they discussed what to sell and what to keep. It was in the middle of this triumphant survey of their new assets that the doorbell chimed. A courier stood on the porch with a crisp, official-looking envelope. It was from the law offices of David Chen, formally requesting their presence for the reading of the final will and testament of Margaret O'Brien. I can only imagine the cold dread that must have washed over them. The letter's tone was jarringly legalistic, a world away from the cozy, fraudulent document they had guided my hand to sign. They arrived at David's polished downtown office looking visibly unnerved. I had instructed David to be stern professional and impassive, and he played his part perfectly. He did not read the will they were expecting. Instead, he presented my true final testament explaining that it had been signed and notarized just a month before my passing. To preempt any challenge to my mental state, he played a short silent video on a large screen, security footage of me clear-eyed and steady, handing the evidence package to the courier. Their faces went pale. As David began to read from the will, specifically the section where I detailed their recent campaign of isolation and control, the pressure finally broke Mark. He began to sob, a shuddering, pathetic sound. He confessed everything right there in the sterile conference room, the collapse of his business, the mountains of debt, the crippling terror of losing their social standing. He kept repeating that they had no choice, that they were just trying to survive, exposing the raw, desperate history that had fueled their cruelty. Mark's confession was the spark that ignited the bonfire of their failed conspiracy. Susan, her face a mask of contempt, turned on him furiously. I watched as she spat out that this was his mess, that his stupid company and his ego had ruined them. The argument devolved into a storm of bitter recriminations. All the years of resentment of keeping up appearances of shared and secret fears erupted in that room. They were no longer partners in crime. They were just two drowning people pulling each other under. Their unified front, which they had so carefully constructed, shattered completely under the weight of their failure. David let them exhaust themselves for a moment before he cut through the noise, his voice as cold and sharp as steel. He informed them that their personal difficulties were entirely irrelevant to the matter at hand. The room fell silent. He then delivered the final masterful stroke I had planned with him. He told them that my will contained one final primary clause that superseded everything else he had just read. The full details of that clause, he explained, would be revealed at a final meeting with the estate's executor. And with that, they were dismissed. They stumbled out of his office not as triumphant heirs, but as powerless, terrified individuals. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the chilling, uncertain dread of the public consequences that were yet to come. The week between the initial will reading and the final meeting must have been the longest of their lives. When Susan and Mark were shown into the larger conference room at David Chen's firm, I watched their faces fall. They were expecting a private, legalistic meeting. They were not expecting a jury, but that's what I had arranged. Sitting at the long, polished table were my two sisters, their aunts Clara and June, and Arthur Vance, a dear friend of my late husband's, and a respected pillar of their community. Their presence signaled that this was not just about money, it was a reckoning. Susan and Mark lived and breathed for their social standing, so I knew their true punishment had to be a social one. David began, his voice calm and methodical. He didn't raise it once. He simply laid out the case piece by devastating piece. He started by reading from my handwritten letter. My own words filled the silent room, describing the screened phone calls, the intercepted mail, the way they turned away my friends, and the final quiet betrayal of the fraudulent will signing. Then he moved to the financial evidence. He presented copies of the down payment they had made on the new Mercedes, along with printed-out social media posts from their friends, congratulating them on their expected windfall. He contrasted this with my own modest bank statements, the careful budget of a retired teacher. The deception was laid bare for everyone to see, a cold, undeniable tapestry of greed and disrespect. The judgment, when it came, was not loud. It was silent and swift. I saw my sister Clara, who had always been so fond of Susan, look at her niece with an expression of pure, undiluted disgust. My other sister, June, simply looked heartbroken. Arthur Vance, the man whose respect Mark had always craved, just slowly shook his head in profound disappointment, not even meeting their eyes. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation. There was only the heavy, crushing weight of their condemnation. In that silent moment, everything Susan and Mark had worked for, the image they had curated, the social standing they had sacrificed their integrity to protect, evaporated into thin air. Then David delivered the final blow. He gestured to a woman who had been sitting quietly in the corner, a woman they hadn't even noticed. He introduced her as Ms. Albright, the director of the New York Children's Literacy Fund. A flicker of confusion crossed Susan's face. David then read the final primary and irrevocable clause of my will. He explained that months ago I had placed my entire estate, the multi-million-dollar house in Westchester, the stocks, the savings, everything, into an irrevocable charitable trust. The foundation was the sole beneficiary. As the meaning of his words settled in the dead silent room, Ms. Albright stood up, walked over to the table, and placed a legal document in front of a stunned Susan and Mark. It was a formal notice of eviction. They had 30 days to vacate my property. The final consequence was not just disinheritance, it was homelessness. My life's work would not fuel their lies. It would teach children how to read. That was my final word. The fallout from that final meeting was exactly as I had intended: swift, brutal, and public. With my sisters and Arthur Vance as witnesses, the story of Susan and Mark's deception spread like wildfire through the family and their carefully curated social circles. The private financial ruin they had feared became the public spectacle they had dreaded even more. Their phones, I imagine, went unanswered. Invitations dried up. The final killing blow was a quiet, formal letter from the board of their country club suggesting it would be best if they resigned their membership. They were ostracized, cut adrift from the very world they had sacrificed their souls to impress. From where I watch now, I can see the two divergent paths they took in the wake of their ruin. Mark, stripped of all his bluster and arrogance, was broken. He was forced to declare bankruptcy, a public admission of the failure he had tried so desperately to hide. He took a low-level sales job selling electronics at a big box store, a humbled man forced to finally confront the consequences of his actions. For him, it was the beginning of a long, slow, and painful path toward accountability. But Susan, my daughter, remained trapped in her bitterness. She learned nothing. She blamed everyone. She blamed Mark for his weakness, she blamed the lawyers for their tricks, and she blamed me for my cruelty. She could never accept her own role in the disaster, choosing instead to curdle in a stew of resentment and denial. But my story doesn't end with their ruin. It ends with a new beginning. My quiet, stately home in Westchester, the house that had become my prison, was transformed. The for sale sign never went up. Instead, a new sign was raised, one bearing the name, the Margaret O'Brien Reading Center for Children. The silence was replaced by the sound of laughter and learning. The rooms where I had felt so isolated were filled with shelves of books and small tables where children sat, their faces illuminated by the wonder of stories. The local paper even wrote a small article, not about a family scandal, but about the incredible charitable bequest of a retired teacher whose final act was one of immense generosity to her community. The last thing I see is a quiet afternoon in late summer. A group of children are sitting on the green lawn where my husband and I once hosted garden parties, each of them lost in a book. The camera of my memory pans slowly to a simple bronze plaque near the front door, gleaming in the sun. It reads, "The Margaret O'Brien Reading Center. For a lifetime dedicated to knowledge, kindness, and the enduring power of a story." My pain had been a private thing, a deep and personal wound. But in the end, it was transformed into a public purpose, a permanent and powerful reality created from the ashes of my children's greed. And that, I think, is a good ending to the story. In the end, the very ruin Susan and Mark feared was the one they created. Their desperate choices, born from a cocktail of shame and greed, led them not to salvation, but to the public collapse they dreaded most. But Margaret's story teaches a deeper lesson. It shows that true justice isn't merely about watching the guilty receive their due, it's about the quiet power of transforming personal pain into public purpose, ensuring a story that began with selfish greed ends with a lasting gift of generosity for generations to come.